bienvenue au Congrès annuel de l'ACAM dans la belle ville de Quebec. They really have rolled out the nice weather for us. My name is Kevin Dixon, and I have the privilege of serving as your president. I've been doing that for the last year. Hopefully none of you have noticed me. That's perfect. That's what I planned. I'm very proud to be here today on behalf of the board of directors and staff at CAPA to officially welcome you to Quebec City. It's been a long time since we've been able to meet in person. 2019 was the last time we had a conference in Niagara Falls, and I want to thank all the dear friends that have taken the chance to notice how much hair I've lost. I really appreciate that. It is nice to see you all as well. Before we begin, I want to take a moment and acknowledge with great respect the land that we're on is the traditional unceded territory of the Huron-Wendat people. By taking time to make that acknowledgement, I hope to grow trust and bonds between our peoples and that we can move forward together. It's hard to believe that it's been 3 years. Since then, as an organization, we've been strong. Advocacy work has continued, and we've made a lot of great progress across Canada. Later today, in the annual general meeting, you'll hear item by item what we've been doing, and I think you're going to be very pleased as a membership. As the president and member of the board of directors, I'm very appreciative of the efforts of the staff, other board members, and individual PAs for your advocacy. Well done. Nous avons fait énormément de progrès pendant l'année et c'est à cause plutôt des efforts individuels et de l'équipe en total. Merci beaucoup. Over this weekend, we're going to have a chance to celebrate the profession and the great things we do for patients. We'll be able to reunite, attend lectures, and spend time together. Take advantage of this time together, this break from your busy lives, share experiences. I look forward to hearing yours. I want to hear your stories. There's a great lineup of presentations. Please take advantage of all the lectures and gain all those great CPD credits. There's no doubt that you're going to leave Quebec City with valuable skills and share the experiences of your teammates. Later today, we'll have a chance to celebrate individual efforts with the awards ceremony. I look forward to seeing you again. You'll hear more speeches. Good luck. We're going to start an exciting program today with our keynote speaker. In the panel on primary care for Indigenous communities. I'm going to leave a lot of the introduction to Guillaume, who's put in a lot of work putting this excellent group together, but I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say. This is a key area of development that needs to be looked at in Canada. These are vulnerable groups and they need resources, and PAs can be that resource. There's a few housekeeping items I'd like to make note of. I think the first one in the program, you're going to notice the Surgeon General is referred to as a colonel and later as a brigadier general. He's neither. He's a major general. We're sorry for the typo. As you know, today is Remembrance Day. At all times, we will be mindful of our friends and colleagues. This has been an especially bad month within the military medical community. Some friends have been lost, and they are on my mind today as they have been over the past month. We will take a break after the keynote speaker, and there's a short walk down to Senatov, and though we invite everyone to join us in what will be a major Remembrance Day ceremony in one of Canada's premier cities. And from my point of view, coming from Fredericton, that's quite an opportunity that I don't plan on missing. Certainly the weather is going to cooperate. I've stood in a few miserable Remembrance Day parades, so this will be a nice change. So since its beginning, CAPA's motto has always been for PAs by PAs, and the PAs who make up the 2022 Education Planning Committee outdid themselves this year by putting together an outstanding program for us. I'd like to take a moment to recognize the members who worked so hard on this event, and I'll ask the members here today to give them a round of applause. So Guillaume Couture, merci beaucoup. Jean-Nicolas Chagnon, merci. Eric Mayo, merci. Sharona Konofsky, thank you very much. Eric Thompson, I don't think is here, but if you can hear us, thank you very much, Eric, for your hard work. Suffice it to say, this high-quality conference wouldn't be possible without their hard work. There are a lot of other contributors to this conference behind the scene. Some of them contribute financially, some of them hard work, some of them other types of support. In particular, I want to thank the Ontario Medical Association. Physicians and PAs are partners in clinical practice, and their financial support to CAPA to support this conference is truly appreciated. Thank you very much. Further, we'd like to thank Smith & Reed, who is CAPA's professional liability insurance, Alberta Health Services. AHS is Canada's first and largest province-wide fully integrated health system, delivering health services to more than 4.4 million people living in Alberta. We'd also like to thank and acknowledge Mesure Learning, which was previously known as Yardstick, which holds a soft spot in all our hearts for having run the exam that we all wrote. Mesure develops, delivers, proctors, and analyzes higher education and credentialing exams like our PA certification exam. We're proud to count them as our sponsors and help make CAPA 22 a success. In addition, we have generous exhibitors and sponsors such as the Canadian Armed Forces, Doctors Nova Scotia, the personal insurance company, Smith & Reed, NCCPA, AT Still University, University of Manitoba, PEPID, Marcel Lavallee, NeilMed Pharmaceuticals, and EMRAP. They contribute in a number of ways to make this conference possible. We can show our appreciation by stopping at their booths, hearing what they have to say. I encourage you to take time during the breaks to visit with these sponsors. At this time, we'll just give a brief round of support and applause for our sponsors. Thank you very much for everything. Other important things, you can check out the CAPA 22 website and keep on track with different updates and follow on any changes. There's a lot happening over the next 3 days, and we'll be using that updates platform to keep send reminders and updates. It's important that you fill out your evaluations for sessions that you attend. That's how your CPD time is tracked, and in that way you'll receive notification of the credits. And the only way is by doing the evaluations. Later today, I invite and encourage everybody to attend the annual General Members meeting at 3:30 here in this room. There'll be a number of important updates about events across the country, and you'll get a bigger picture of what's going on with PAs in Canada. Take time to post, tweet, flip-flop, TikTok, whatever you want, different social media, so that our friends that are not here can appreciate the good time that we're having. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Guillaume Couture, and he's going to introduce our keynote panel. Thanks very much. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Bonjour à tous. Bienvenue à la conférence CAPA à Québec, ou de la CAM en français, bien sûr. Je vais prendre le temps en français, moi également, de reconnaître qu'on est sur la terre non cédée des Hurons-Wendat. Je ne m'identifie pas comme une Première Nation. Et on a fait cette préparation pour cette table ronde, justement pour offrir les possibilités que les PA peuvent donner aux communautés qui en ont plus besoin. At this time, I would like to present you our keynote panelist who's going to actually moderate this presentation. Britton Sprules is a graduate from the inaugural class of the University of Toronto's Consortium of PA Education and has been working in primary care in Thunder Bay, Ontario for over 10 years. In 2012, she joined the Northern Ontario School of Medicine University as an assistant professor, and in 2017, she joined the Consortium of PA Education program as a clinical course director. She recently completed her master's in health profession education at Queen's University. And for her capstone project, she looked at the Indigenous education component of the 3 Canadian PA program and what can be done to better prepare PA graduates for working with the Indigenous population. So without further ado, Britton Sprules, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Guillaume, and thank you everyone for joining us here this morning. I know it's a little bit early for some of you, depending where you are in the country, and hopefully you've had a time to grab a coffee or tea, but I'm thinking you might not need it. We've got a really interesting discussion this morning. We'll hopefully keep you all tuned in. So the topic for today's discussion is improving equity and access in primary care for Indigenous communities through PA care integration. When I read titles like that, I have to digest it and think about it in my own words. And I think what we really want to talk about today is how the PA model can improve access to primary care for Indigenous communities in a way that is supportive and equitable. So we did have 4 panelists originally scheduled for today, but unfortunately, Dr. Joseph LeBlanc was unable to join us today due to COVID. So he was unable to get out of bed this morning. He sends his regrets and really wishes he could have been here with all of you today. I will introduce the other 3 panelists. Their full bios can be found on the CAPA 2022 website. We've shortened them today for time purposes. So this morning we have Quanah Tickett. She is an American-trained physician assistant working as a community health aid instructor at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium and previously worked at South Central Foundation. Prior to becoming a PA, she worked in both an OBGYN and a family medicine clinic as a certified medical assistant, and previously as a community health aide in the village of Selawik, Alaska. She became certified as a PA through the University of Washington's MEDEX program and the University of Alaska Anchorage. She is an Alaskan native of Inupiaq descent. So welcome, Quanah. We also have today Liila Gillis. She is a federal government nurse leader whose career has been dedicated to service to Indigenous populations at the local, provincial, regional, and national levels. As Deputy Chief Nursing Officer and Senior Director at Indigenous Services Canada, Liila continues to work to meet Canada's commitment to support First Nations and Inuit full ownership and control of health services, a career that was built on a foundation of frontline practice in both Inuit, the Nangat, and First Nations communities. Liila is a member of the National Principal Nursing Advisors Task Force and has joined international delegations representing Canada at meetings of the International Council of Nurses and the World Health Organization. Welcome, Liila. We also have here today Tara Clark. She began her medical career as a rural paramedic for some of Manitoba's most underserved communities. After 10 years in the field, Tara navigated a career change in 2010, entered the master's degree physician assistant program at the University of Manitoba. Passionate about emergency medicine, she worked for 8 years in rural and urban emergency rooms. In 2019, an opportunity presented to participate on the Manitoba First Nations COVID-19 Rapid Response Team out of Ongomizwin Health Services, or OHS. And she became the first PA hired on the team and grew to occupy a seat of one of 4 coordinators. Through this, OHS was introduced to the concept of PAs and asked her to pioneer the creation of models for PA use in serving First Nations communities. Tara is now the lead for the OHS Physician and Clinical Assistant Program and continues to practice as an acute care PA, working in many nursing stations and hospital sites. Tara also holds an academic appointment at U of M, serving as a clinical instructor and evaluator. Welcome, Tara. So thank you very much to our panelists for joining us today. We're really looking forward to the discussions that are about to unfold. We've prepared some questions to help direct the conversation, but really hoping for an open and authentic discussion today. And for purposes of having a conference in person and online, we ask that questions are all held until the end. So to get started with our first question, I'm going to open it up to you, Quanah. From a cultural perspective, what does healthcare mean to you? And Quanah, we're wondering if you can share your lived experience.
Good morning. Sorry, I have a cold, so my voice is a little scratchy. So healthcare, I think, is treating the whole person, mind, body, and soul. Each person has their own upbringing, some healthy and some not so. And whatever the person has gone through in life, they have to deal with it. And taking care of their mental health has a lot to do with how their body functions and how they care for themselves. Also, culture and subsistence is a way of life that a lot of our Indigenous people have grown up doing, such as myself. I went to fish camp and we gather with the seasons, and if they steer in a different direction later on and not gather food or practice their cultural beliefs of their upbringing, then I think people don't feel whole and they are missing a piece of themselves. And so being culturally in tune keeps their mind healthy. In the clinics here at ANTHC and South Central Foundation, we have integrated behavioral health care providers in some clinics and make them available even through FaceTime visits. So I think that whole person, mind, body, and soul is very important to a person's health. Thank you.
Thank you, Kwana. Liila, I'm wondering if you can comment from a health system administrative perspective.
Sure. Thanks very much. And hello, everybody. And first and foremost, thank you very much for entrusting a registered nurse to join your team and here today. And I would like to just situate myself a little bit for the rest of the conversation, in that I do work within Indigenous Services Canada. We are the national department that supports and advocates for healthcare services for Indigenous people across the country. My particular role is has responsibility for healthcare services for the most part in the north of the provinces. So just to identify that I do not represent health services of the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, Yukon. However, I work very collaboratively with those groups. I am very happy to be joining you today from my home in Ottawa, in the most beautiful unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And of course, on this November 11th, I want to acknowledge the courage and sacrifice of those who've served this country and others. We're forever grateful, and I acknowledge the number of physician assistants who serve this country as well. So I think that, you know, although I am not an Indigenous person, I have worked within Indigenous healthcare for 30 years. And, you know, the mandate, and I think how I see as a health system administrator and how culture and what it means within the healthcare system, it reflects to the mandate of this department, which is similar to your own mandate as an association of physician assistants, you know, for PAs by PAs. And I believe that, you know, within the healthcare system, it should be for Indigenous people by Indigenous people. And the mandate of Indigenous Services Canada is to move to First Nation ownership and control of healthcare services. We have some very good exemplars of that across the country, to sort of share what I mean by that, and one being among many, but the First Nations Health Authority in British Columbia, in that the Government of Canada has, through agreement with a group of, or I guess province-wide, an aggregate of First Nations in British Columbia, have transferred the control of the service delivery to the First Nations Health Authority. And they have done an excellent job of bringing cultural competence and Indigenous lens and perspective to the design of their healthcare system. So, you know, I believe that I've lived it for many, many years, and I'll speak a little more later about some of the historical perspectives of where we've come from. But I certainly see culture as being the core of a successful healthcare system that serves safe healthcare to Indigenous people across the country. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the need for a distinction-based approach to health service design and delivery. And by that, I mean, obviously within the Indigenous populations across this country are a significant diversity of culture, language, traditions, and, not applying a sort of generic, I guess, perspective to health services. There must be a distinction based on the local cultural historic perspectives of the Indigenous people who are receiving that healthcare. And I believe at the core of that, as a health system administrator, applying that lens, having the ownership and control will lead to a healthcare service that is free of racism and the experiences certainly existing with the current and certainly historic systems of Indigenous people has not been that. And so all of these efforts to design healthcare systems or for Indigenous people to design healthcare systems that meet their individual and distinct needs is also part of the solution of a system that is free of racism and that is safe for the clients who expect and deserve that service. So I guess in summary, Indigenous Services Canada and the organization I represent, as well as my historical experience as a nurse working for a First Nation for many, many years. The key, I think, from a cultural perspective is around ownership and control and for a distinction-based approach that is reflective of the culture, tradition, and very importantly, history of the individuals who are receiving that healthcare must be reflected in the design of the services they receive. So thanks very much, Britton.
Thank you for that, Leila. It was very, very insightful and nice to hear your perspective on all of that. Tara, I know we didn't have you necessarily down to speak to this question, but wondering if you had anything you'd like to add.
Thank you for putting me on the spot. Actually, no, I don't have anything further to add. I think they really captured the essence of the answer, and I really appreciated both of their perspectives on that.
Thank you, Tara. My apologies. Without Dr. LeBlanc here, Tara, I might pop in to question you as well a couple more times. Looking at the history behind the delivery of healthcare, over to you, Kwana. Can you shed light on the distrust Indigenous peoples have about the healthcare system and perhaps what is needed to move forward?
Yeah, so our people have not always had the best healthcare. I've heard a lot of people, the older people that come to the clinic, they felt they were being treated as a number and long waits to be seen and not treated correctly. And so the older generation, they have a hard time trusting the healthcare system. And so a lot of them don't even bother to come to the clinic because of that. So, and I tell the community health aides that I train when they come in for training that they have to earn their trust, and that people have to know that they care and that they're listening and they're there to help them and give the best care for them. And there are also cultural differences that providers need to learn about. So here at our health facility at ANTHC, we have cultural training at the hiring orientation that we do. So each provider that comes through that go out to the villages have to go through this. And so some examples of differences with the Native people here are not looking you straight in the eye when directly speaking with you. Our people look away, which is a sign of respect for you, and raising the eyebrows means yes, and wrinkling them means no. So when you understand the culture and you connect with the people where you're at on their lands, You can help improve health outcomes, and they respect you and they trust you. And so, yeah, learning about their culture and their ways, I think, is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Kwana. And Leila, in your experience, what did healthcare through the Indigenous Services Canada look like, say, 30 years ago compared to what things are like today?
I feel ancient when I approach this, but in fact, I am relative to working within the system. In some ways we've come a long way, and in other ways we haven't. So, the history of health services across this country, particularly in remote and rural communities, has had an evolution, I think, for Indigenous people, but also for many. I come from rural Newfoundland, and a lot of the experiences around health services has been very limited and has evolved from, the various, I think maybe more religious-based service provision associated with various churches, and my own experience, I'll share a little, was in the East, in Newfoundland and Labrador, and the history of health services in the Inuit community that I first went to work. I was, I think, 22 years old when I stepped off my first Twin Otter plane into the community of Nain, which is now Nunatsiavut in Labrador. I was on the tail end, I guess, of the of a missionary style service delivery to the communities. At the time, they were still recruiting a significant number of international nurses working in those environments. The nurses were from across the UK. At the time, it was the Grenfell Mission or the Grenfell Regional Health Services. So associated back to a very, I guess, history of a Christian-based missionary or style service delivery to that population. I was the only Canadian at the time, besides, of course, the locals in the community, providing services. And there really was a lack of understanding of the history and certainly the cultural experiences of the individuals in the community at the time. And it's not to everyone was there, obviously, providing their best service at the time and within the context that they understood. But I had the opportunity to return to that community in September after nearly, just about 30 years. And, I saw what may have been a progressive and slow evolution, but in fact, the nurse in charge at the nursing station that I worked at was in fact a Nunatsiavut beneficiary who is from the community, running that health center as the lead. And, that really is about sort of the progression towards the model, obviously, that I referenced in our original question, which is really about distinction-based ownership and control. And there really has been an evolution towards, and actually when I was in the community and working in Labrador back, 25, 30 years ago, there was a lot of investment in what was a nursing access program, is what it was referred to. And there was a real supportive, dedicated cohort of local nurses who were supported to go through registered nurse training. And they are the individuals who are now running the healthcare system. And so I really think that reflects to physician assistants and, the potential that we all have. And certainly, I see a role for myself and to support and advocate as well. But for supporting the Indigenous youth across this country to take on health careers, including physician assistants, but also to support them in a very concentrated way. And because I've seen firsthand the benefit through 30 years of investing early on in Indigenous and local community members to enter into health professions, and how they have returned and in fact are changing the healthcare system. And I really see, through our progression of our discussion, the real potential in the laddering of Indigenous, both Inuit, First Nations, Métis youth being supported and entering into physician assistant programs as well, so that that will reap its benefits down the road relative to the contribution of bringing that perspective, that lived experience, and that competence to your profession as well. So I do think that over the years we've come slowly and progressively towards increasing the Indigenous footprint within the professions, which inevitably is going to and has changed, I think, the competence overall and safety of the healthcare system from a cultural perspective. So thanks very much, Britton, for the question.
Thank you very much again for both of you. Nice to hear your perspectives on this. Tara, I'm wondering if over the years of your experience, both as a PA and as a paramedic, if you've noticed, when you're working in your nursing stations, if you've noticed any distrust from the Indigenous communities towards your care as either a PA or as a paramedic.
Sorry, that's a tough question. I think that certainly I have seen the distrust that exists, as we all know, and I think there has been some growth and progress made, but I think there's still a lot of work to do. And that's part of, I think, what motivates me to do this work. I think cultural safety is really central to our work, and I'll speak a little bit later on onto some of the progress that we've made and try to focus the spotlight on the disparities that exist between our Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians.
Thank you, Tara. And so everyone's aware, Leila and Kwana were prepared with the questions, but I'm just throwing them at Tara. So you're doing a great job, Tara. Thank you. Okay, so next question is, let's examine the services and resources required to increase access to primary care. So Leila, again, speaking from an administrator perspective, what is your take on this?
Thanks very much, Britton. The future of healthcare across Canada, now more than ever, lies in providing, the providers working in interprofessional teams. Primary care, but there's when you get into remote health care services, the spectrum of services is even broader. And so, from public health promotion through to urgent, emergent care, long-term care, chronic disease prevention, that sort of the days of our old RN-based kind of model for remote and isolated services is antiquated and has to change. There's no doubt that registered nurses are generalists and could and have been supporting the system for a long time. However, there's not the supply, there's not the but also there's so many other providers who can also contribute to a comprehensive health service delivery and improve the access for remote services. Since about 2017, we've been as a branch within as a First Nations Inuit Health branch within Indigenous Services Canada, we have really been exploring how we can diversify and optimize skill mix within our teams. Recognizing that from, certainly the spectrum of regulated nurses, but also, the important role that midwives can play, paramedicine, physician assistants. We, in fact, have been really looking at how we can stop looking from a provider-centric model and explore it being an actual competency-based and skill mix lens that we apply to the teams that we put in place for healthcare services based on the needs of the community, diversifying that workforce and providing the right provider at the right time, providing the right service to the individual at the community level. So, I do think that, primary care, there's a lot more providers in the system now than there was 30 years ago, including physician assistants as an important part of that model. So I do think, what's needed is around actively breaking the old mold and the old ways of providing services across the healthcare system. Our healthcare system's in crisis. The canary in the mine, I think, is always the remote locations that have a little less of that access to the secondary and tertiary care services. So, I think what's needed is to diversify the skill mix, to shake the old models of care and really explore optimizing skill mix, diversifying the workforce at the community level, of course, increasing and diversifying and increasing the diversity of that workforce, including Indigenous youth and community members to become health professionals. And, as it comes to our healthcare system, it's complex. and Kwana, coming from, the United States, I mean, I can imagine our publicly funded healthcare system is potentially a bit confusing to you. But we have the Canada Health Act that really sort of dictates and it intertwines a bit specifically with physician assistants, because it does reference and incorporate physicians within that hospital, certainly hospital care and physicians. And what comes with that is a very complex model of physician remuneration. Those models across the country are legislated and controlled by the provincial healthcare systems. And, I think that at the core of that comes, I think, some of the, as an administrator of healthcare services, to increase access to primary care, I do think the physician remuneration models need to be reflected on, either to, in a more concentrated and significant way, incorporate the physician assistant role within those models, and or shift to, a different funding model and potentially salary-based models for both physicians and physician assistants in a distinct way. I do think that for remote, for sure, but there is a bigger crisis, I would suggest, for access to primary care in the rural communities across this country. So I think that whereas, the service provision is a little clearer when it's sort of a salary-based funding model, but when it's a fee-for-service model, it does complicate the administration of that service. So I think it warrants, administrators at the provincial level, as well as our colleagues within the federal government who work on the transfers to, we've just had a First Minister's meeting in British Columbia earlier is it this week? My days are, but where I'm sure those discussions are happening, because there really needs to be, I know that provinces are, after the federal government for increased transfer payments, et cetera. But at the end of the day, I think Canada, coming from my perspective, we have a role in partnering and negotiating with our provincial counterparts to, with those transfer payments, perhaps having some, new ways of supporting healthcare services, particularly primary care services, with some criteria that go along with that funding, so that we can influence change. So that's certainly my perspective around increasing access to primary care. I do think, and perhaps we'll talk a little more about it later, but the access certainly at the rural level as well, a more concentrated, I think they call it like I'm trying to think of the hub and spoke model, I think it is, around sort of potentially, depending on, the regulation of physician assistants, et cetera, across the country, being linked to a physician, but also having the physician assistants being that spoke to all of those rural communities. And I think there's a lot of potential to, in combination with nurse practitioners and others, to really improve the access to primary care for both rural and remote Canadians. So thanks, Britton.
Thanks. Yes, I couldn't agree more. And I appreciate, as an RN, your understanding of PAs and understanding how we can help the system. As a PA conference, so many of us are wondering what PAs have to do with all of this and how the PA model can help. So Tara, can you share with us the pioneering efforts taking place in Manitoba and how maybe other provinces could leverage the PA model of care?
For sure. Thanks, Britton. I think Manitoba has always been a really progressive province for our profession. And there is an incredible number of PAs that are doing all sorts of pioneering. So I'm just one of many, but it definitely would be a privilege to share our story of what we're doing with Ongomiswin Health to enhance access and services to some of our First Nations communities here in Manitoba. So when I was a PA student at the University of Manitoba in 2011, I was exposed to what was called at the time the Northern Medical Unit, which was this esteemed, specialized clinical resource program for physician services that sent family docs and visiting specialists into Churchill and Nunavut and other Northern First Nations communities. Their office was located actually just across the hallway from the PA program office, but I think it may as well have been in Churchill just because at the time, the doors were really closed to PAs. They hadn't had any exposure to us, but I was very much drawn to the work that they did, and I really wanted to be a part of it. You see, I had a former career, as you mentioned, as a rural paramedic, and we used to serve a lot of road accessible First Nations communities, and I really loved everything about it. It is just such a different world from your traditional, like highly urbanized, tech-centric practice models. I kind of am a bit old school. I like to think with my brain and use my hands, some common sense, maybe a pen. And I really thrive in resource poor environments. So as much as the medicine was challenging and exciting, it was also hard to witness sometimes. There are components of third world countries an hour away from my home. And I definitely appreciated the impacts of the social determinants of health. And it convinced me that we definitely do not all have equitable access to healthcare services. So I spent the next 8 years as a PA working in very busy emergency rooms. I love the medicine, but again, very kind of narrowed scope and restricted practice. And I just didn't find it super rewarding as a person. And then the pandemic hit. So fast forward, the Northern Medical Unit had been renamed the Ongomiswin Institute, and the clinical services arm of that was Ongomiswin Health Services, or OHS. No offense to Leila, it was refreshingly progressive of the federal government in their response to this pandemic versus how things came out in the H1N1 epidemic in 2009, that the federal government agreed to a very innovative solution that was proposed by Ombudsman that would prioritize supports for First Nations communities in Manitoba. And so the Manitoba First Nations COVID-19 Rapid Response Team program was born, which really required an unprecedented merging of multiple levels of government, different First Nations advocacy groups, tribal health councils, and Ombudsman. So OHS would operationalize the rapid response teams, which were basically various multidisciplinary healthcare teams that would function as containment teams and surge supports, supporting different First Nations communities that were experiencing strain above their baseline functional needs. And the mandate was to train doctors, physician assistants, clinical assistants, nurses, paramedics, occupational therapists, physiotherapists on the testing, public health messaging, outbreak management, and then deploy them in small teams into those communities that were experiencing outbreaks. I happened to be the very first PA that was hired. I went on 8 different deployments and had the opportunity to work alongside our Canadian military, the Red Cross. And I got to witness mountains being moved collectively. I drove a school bus and rode in the back of a snowmobile and traveled all over. And I really saw what could be accomplished when you remove the proverbial red tape and focus on the needs of the community. So the RRT was overseen by 4 coordinators, one of whom happened to be Dr. Ian Wetter, who is the medical director for OHS. I became one of the coordinators and spent several months working very close with him. The RRT went on to complete a total of 167 deployments and received some federal recognition by way of a very nice plaque that is in our office. But more importantly, we made a very significant impact on the lives of many First Nations people, especially those in some of the most remote and isolated areas. And I think ultimately we carved new collaborative pathways and relationships. So even though the RRT did decommission, I think the value of PAs and just innovative thinking was not lost on Ombudsman or FNIB, and that a new door was opened and an opportunity for a seat at the table opened up. So the door kind of opened up through that. And that is our seed story of how we started and how PAs were able to kind of enter the landscape. From there, I worked with OHS leadership, and we've developed a business model and a framework for PA integration. And if I had to sort of outline our recipe and some of the keys for our success, it would be that first, we follow the Indigenous teachings of doing things in a good way and leading from the heart. 2, I think you need to have the right pillars of support. So folks like Dr. Ian Wetter and Dr. Sarah Goulet, who has served as one of my mentors as a clinician leader. 3, I think having a design for PAs that's done by a PA has been helpful because you have someone that's worked on the ground and really understands how to optimize our function. 4, it would be to hire the right people who share an altruistic philosophy. We offer individualized in-community mentorship that's done by our PAs and supported by our physicians. An example would be a shout out to Jan Drutz, who is a pioneer in his own rights for being the very first PA to ever work in Canada. He is now working 2 weeks a month in Barons River, which historically has struggled to have physician services. Our PAs are practicing primary care as well as acute care and on-call. I think we have learned to build depth and capacity from within. We work very collaboratively with the Master Physician Assistant Studies program at the University of Manitoba to offer PA preceptors for clinical rotation sites so that students have early exposure along their learning trajectory. And then I think, as Leola alluded to, it's important to kind of break the molds. So for us, in terms of how PAs are traditionally used, we kind of shaped things a little bit differently in that we offer split site practices and flexible opportunities for work. And we really encourage PAs to work to the fullest capacity of their scopes in very supportive environments. We onboard PAs as contractors in parallel to the physicians. And we've been able to expand the program from an N of 1 to almost 20, and a PA leadership team of 3 in a little under 2 years with funding from our federal partners. I think, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, there is still a lot of listening and a lot of learning to be done. We are very much mindful that we are building the plane while we're flying it. And I've just been very thankful to be part of the opportunity to partner with Angamazwin, which is an Anishinaabe term that means clearing the path for generations to come. And I hope that that will come true for PAs as well. So thanks for the question, Britton.
Thank you, Tara. It sounds like you're doing some amazing work there in Manitoba, and certainly pioneering the care that PAs can provide to these communities. So we know that there's a need to increase access to PA education for Indigenous applicants. Dr. Joseph LeBlanc was going to be here to speak to that, but I'm hoping I can speak to a little bit to it as well. But first, Kwana, I'm wondering if you can speak to us about your journey and your experience of becoming a PA with having come from an Indigenous community.
Yeah, so I grew up in native village of Norvik. It's in the northwest part of Alaska, and so I moved from the village to the city right out of high school, and I started out as a medical assistant because it was quick, and I also wanted to see if I liked the healthcare field. And so I did that for 5 years. And after 5 years in the city, we moved back to the village to my husband's community of Selwick. And I was a community health aide there for 5 years. And I gained a lot of healthcare experience doing that. The health aides take care of the people in the rural communities, the villages. And so I helped with a lot of trauma, chronic issues, acute care problems that I was trained to do. And the community health aides are people from the villages that come into the city to get trained on how to do histories and exams. And we're like the eyes and ears of the doctor. Then we report to the people in the bigger hubs and learn to treat like ear infections and all that. So when we decided to move back to the city, I worked again as a medical assistant, and I knew that I could do more because of my health aid experience. And so I started taking prerequisites to get into PA school. And so growing up in the village, I didn't even know how to apply to a college because, we don't have a college there in the village. And so I had to ask some of my coworkers, what do I need to do to get into college? What is the first step I need to do? And so they told me you apply for admissions and then you can choose classes. And so when I took my first class, it was an English class. And, I didn't speak very good English because I grew up in the village and we spoke broken English and mixed with some of our Inupiaq language. And so I didn't know the big words that the professors talked about. And so I had to keep a dictionary with me to look up words when I didn't know the words. And so so after I passed that first English class, I believed in myself. I was like, wow, I can actually pass a college course. And so I took one class after another, and all my prerequisites added up until I could apply to the PA program. And so that's what I did. And so PA school wasn't always easy for me because of like my grammar, and I have to write papers. So I had a few of my classmates proofread and correct my grammar on my papers that I wrote before I submitted them. And that was a very big help. So I think, so for the community health aides that come in for training from the villages to Anchorage, we teach them, we have a university credit class. So we teach them what they need to do to get started in taking classes and what classes they should take, and like each step so a lot of the health aides ask me, how did you get into PA school and what did you do? And so I wrote a 2-page step-by-step, okay, you need to apply to a college and then do this and this. And so I think that really helps them a lot. So I think promotion. So people in the village, they don't know, a lot of people don't even know what a PA is. And so I think like promoting, telling them about it, and like step-by-step instructions, like what you need to do to go get into PA school. And I think that would be very helpful. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Kwana. So again, Dr. LeBlanc was going to speak about his experience and his role at NOSM University. So from what I know as a NOSM professor, there is an Indigenous stream where there's a lot of support for Indigenous applicants, including how to prepare for MMIs, for example. So they bring the students in and help them prepare on how to be successful in MMI. NOSM and Lakehead also go to communities to help introduce healthcare careers to the locals, so encouraging them to apply for these professions, including the PA profession. I was part of a program called Camp Med, which is for high school students. I was on a panel of healthcare professionals and introduced the topic of a PA. There was a nurse practitioner there as well, OT, PT, and a few more. But to introduce these professions that maybe these high school students don't even know that exist. So we spoke about PA as a profession, how to apply, where to apply, what the job might look like. And, I think there's room for improvement. So right now, McMaster and Manitoba, any self-identified Indigenous applicant is invited to interview as long as they meet all the program requirements. But I think from your experience, Kwana, meeting those requirements is also a huge barrier and something that we need to help students with. So breaking down those barriers, providing some training before even the application stage, or we're going to lose the ability to train these students in their communities to then complete the program and go back to these communities and provide care. Because I think that hub and spoke model will only go so far, because you're still uprooting someone to then go to all these communities and provide care, where if we can train those in the communities in the first place, I think they're more likely to stay and provide culturally safe healthcare within those communities. Before we move on to sort of closing comments from the panelists on this topic of education, or I wonder if there's anyone who has anything further to add before we move to closing comments. Okay, well, one by one, I will call on you then to just provide your closing comments on this session, and then we will move on to hopefully some good questions from the audience. So Liala, we can start with you. Any closing comments?
Wow, closing already. So time flies when you're having fun. So super interesting and so valuable. I just want to say for me in regards to my learning, and I really appreciate it. Like for your members, certainly to know the strong advocacy role that your association has been playing for you, certainly within certainly the federal government, and I expect also within the provincial governments as well. There's always and I believe for physician assistants specifically, systemic barriers that have been out there, and I think midwives as well have experienced some of that within sort of changes to the healthcare system, situating within the healthcare system. I think Tara very articulately explained the benefit of, for lack of a better term, necessity being the mother of invention, right? When it comes to the pandemic, it was like, let's push out those barriers and show what's possible. And that's huge because, in the before times, I think that, there would be particular barriers, whether it be regulatory or just like models of care wise or others that would have prevented some of those innovations and happening. But this is the time is now, I think, for physician assistants. I think that, and for diversity, both in culture, but also in skill mix, to find solutions to the crisis we are experiencing across the country. In all aspects of our healthcare systems, I think there's a space for physician assistants in every part of the healthcare system, of course. Long-term care is struggling as well and needs those models of care to be inclusive of, and I'm sure are in many circumstances. So, because I think that labor market space, having that incorporation and inclusion of physician assistants within the labor market sort of creates the demand. And then I think that improves the sort of investment and supports within the education system. So it's all kind of a bit of a circle that I think you've been approaching, really wisely in regards to sort of advancing your profession within Canada. So, I think there are so many gaps to be filled. I think that every profession has a role to play. And I think physician assistants have been really situating yourselves wisely to fill the gap within primary care specifically. As I mentioned throughout, I do believe there are, and I think Tara explained really well, just huge gaps in equity and access for remote communities. But I think it's even more so for rural Indigenous communities across the country. And so, it's certainly one of my goals to try and explore that, because it's one of those rural communities are even more, the complexity is even more evident of the jurisdictional issues between the various systems, between the provincial government, the federal government. And so, I think that those need to be, resolved. And so I do think that, across the country, that your continued advocacy and growth and as you increase your supply, I think that there's more than enough need within and space for that diversified interdisciplinary team approach to primary care for rural and remote, as well as, of course, within urban healthcare as well. So I'm so grateful to have been invited and to have been able to hear the wisdom and learnings from Kwana and from Tara, like those well, in fact, really pioneering approaches within many of the remote communities in Manitoba. I've certainly heard lots about it from the federal government side and the support for some of those programs. And I hope that there will be more of that. And I think that the ceiling has been broken, I think, through some of those innovations that happened as a result of the pandemic, and we've all learned from it. And I think it will do everything to help advance the diversification of the workforce that are serving both rural and remote, but also just in the mainstream healthcare system. And I really am encouraged for what's left of my career, to observe and see the growth of physician assistants within that solution and within the models moving forward. So I really appreciate being here today and being able to hear everyone's perspective. So thanks very much, Brendan.
Thank you. Over to you, Tara. Any final comments, remarks, thoughts?
I would say that in keeping with the spirit of reconciliation, we all could do a lot more listening. It might sound a bit cliche, but I try to operate from a place of having courage in our hearts and with our actions, and would encourage all of my PA counterparts to forge into territories maybe not yet explored by PAs before you, and have courage to do good work. And I think the value of us will speak for itself. Don't be discouraged by adversity. Our First Nations patients face it every day. Really be an advocate to challenge those norms, and remember what can be done when titles and jurisdictional boundaries are set aside and people just help people. So I really echo the sentiments of my fellow panelists this morning, and I'm happy to hear that maybe a nugget has made its way up to the federal government, and we've been able to shine a spotlight on a really important topic. And thanks for letting me speak a little bit around it today.
Thank you, Tara. And Kwan, I'll come to you in just a second. I was going to touch base with Dr. LeBlanc to summarize what he had spoken about. And while I certainly can't fill his big shoes, I can speak a little bit to the educational component. So I think, first of all, we really need to provide improved training within the programs for students to understand Indigenous perspectives on healthcare. And I think personally, one way of doing that is by having students do clinical rotations within these Indigenous communities, and sort of, live that experience firsthand. And then, for them to see what's going on, as Tara said, sort of 1 hour, potentially 1 hour from our homes, what's going on within these communities that we don't know otherwise unless we're there to experience it. And then beyond that would be to have Indigenous students applying to the programs, and how can we support them within their application to train them so that then they can go home to their Indigenous communities and provide, primary care within their community. Kwana, I will pass it over to you for any last thoughts and your perspectives from a Native American.
So yeah, it sounds like you're already going to the high schools and speaking about all these opportunities, and I think that's a good thing. I've gone back home to my village and spoke to the high school students about the PA program and how they can get in, and I encourage them, if I can do it, you can too. I grew up here in the village, and I made it through, and so you can do that too. And so I think doing like a step-by-step, you need to do this, this, and this would be a big help, because I struggled with, like when I went to the University of Alaska Anchorage, I tried to talk to people and see how I could get into PA school, what classes, and I was sent from this person to that person to another person. And I finally went to the University of Washington website and found that information and went to an information session which was very helpful. And they told me what classes I needed to take first before I apply to the PA program. So yeah, I think going to the small communities and letting them know of these opportunities, maybe finding a couple people, like the high school students or whoever in the community that would be interested in that, and helping them through and showing them the way. So yeah, I think what you guys are doing, talking to the high schools and stuff, is a good thing. So thank you so much for having me. It's 5:30 here in Alaska. I'm going back to bed.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Kwana, so much for joining us at such an early hour. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. There's certainly more discussion to be had as we open up the floor for questions. So Guillaume and I will try and coordinate both in person and online. So please bear with us because I cannot see the room. So Guillaume is going to take questions in person and I'm going to try and take some questions online. Having said that, I don't know if we have a very quiet online group or if I'm actually not seeing the questions come in. But Christy or whoever is moderating also online, I haven't seen any come in unless you have. So maybe while we sort that out, I will pass it over to Guillaume to see if there are any questions in person.
Thank you, Britton, again for your moderating of this panel discussion. Are there any questions from the room in here? There's 2 microphones right up to the front. You can come and ask your question and we'll direct it to the panelists where the question should be answered from. Any questions from the room? So we got one here, Britton.
Hi, Brittany. It's and the panel. It's Eric Amaris. I'm a PA in British Columbia. So thanks for the great conversation. Well led. My question, and maybe I'll put Leah on a spot a little bit, is more about federal leadership in regards to leading the way. So we've had the CMA, the current president and past presidents of the CMA call for national licensure with doctors. So in a case like this, looking at ISC and the services provided, and in this case being the single payer in certain areas, British Columbia also has the First Nation Health Authority. And we've had opportunities in the past where either doctors working within the First Nation Health Authority are looking to hire PAs, and the barriers that come are usually between the interjurisdictional problems. So any thought about leadership from the federal level and doing a pan-Canadian licensure for PAs, which might be easier than doing nurses or doctors or midwives?
Easy question, Eric. No, I think it's a great question, and it's one. There's a lot of those discussions I would suggest happening. Certainly within Health Canada, where a lot of those structural, I would suggest, discussions happen with the first ministers, with the health ministers from across the provinces. Healthcare, as I kind of mentioned, is a complex space when it comes to jurisdictional, I guess, variation across the country for sure. And you know, how to situate Indigenous Services Canada within that is a bit challenging, in that we are not having those discussions with the provincial health services from a regulatory perspective, et cetera. But I did mention where I think some of the levers may be in regards to influencing that. I would suggest across the board, there is a lot of interest and a lot of discussion around either multi-jurisdictional licensure and or national licensure. And certainly CMA are having those discussions, and the various regulators within the regulated nursing groups are having some of those discussions. And you're right, physician assistants are definitely a sort of more concentrated group in regards to exploring that. Yet it still falls, regulation of health professionals falls within provincial jurisdiction. So currently, I'm not aware of any federal legislation that would permit us to do that, but I know that there are many tables exploring the art of the possible now relative to the HHR crisis across the country. I expect that some of those discussions happened in British Columbia this week with the health ministers, meeting with the federal health minister and looking at innovation and innovative ways to from everything from education, remuneration, through to being able to mobilize our workforce across the jurisdictions. The pandemic was scary when it came to our inability to mobilize staff across the country. Our regulators worked really hard to be able to license and regulate people so that we could move them for emergency response. But it highlighted the barriers that are inherent with the current regulatory structures being provincially based. So I think CMA have led have sort of opened the door to those discussions around having some form of national regulatory structure. And so, I think those discussions are placed within, Health Canada does have those discussions with the provincial departments of health and where the regulated health professions acts are situated. But some of that also is around, as I mentioned, aside from, I know your question was a little more about regulation, but I think enveloped in that is also the physician remuneration kind of those models across the country are varied and maybe part of the solution is really revisiting that and how that is administered by the provincial jurisdictions. And that's where I mentioned the lever being, I think, federally potentially is the those discussions on transfer payments with the health jurisdictions across the country, and maybe applying carrots and stick to some of those dollars, because sometimes there can be caveats and requirements associated with some of the federal funding that goes to the provincial government. So there could be, in fact, some possibility. I'm not an expert when it comes to the regulatory discussions that happen across the FPT tables. But there is also within Health Canada a committee on health workforce, and that is an assistant deputy minister level group that I would suggest as physician assistants. It could be a space for you to have those discussions around regulation and to advocate. If I think that some of them, there are various, some of them, I think one of them, in fact, looks at innovation. So, that would be an important table, I would suggest, for physician assistants from an advocacy perspective, is potentially to link into that innovation table within the committee, the national committee, FPT, federal, provincial, territorial. All partners are there around innovation and innovative approaches, and national regulation is, in fact, one of those innovations. I think that could be an important conversation there. So thanks for your question, Eric.
Britton, I'll transfer to you for an online question.
Thanks, Guillaume. I still don't see any questions online. So again, I'm not sure if they just aren't coming in a way that I'm able to see them, or if there aren't any.
Oh, yeah, perfect. I'll let Christy sort this one out. I don't know. Well, we have a question in the room.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Sharona Konofsky. I'm a PA educator in Toronto. Britton and I work together. Hi. Thank you for the panel discussion. It's been great. So we've tried to incorporate some cultural safety elements to our curriculum, and I think it's really important as part of Truth and Reconciliation, just at a bare minimum, to have students understand some of the history and basic foundational information to begin this kind of important work. And our students and our early career PAs are very energetic, and they all have big hearts, and they all want to do good. But sometimes the question about advocacy is, where do I start? What's like a way to get, what's the entry point into being able to make a difference? Not everybody necessarily has the time or capacity to go to rural community and do the work there, like many of you have talked about. But just as an entry point, I'd like to hear from you guys, how can we advise our young PA students who have a lot of energy and are very curious and are also our early entry or early career PAs as to ways to approach advocacy? The way I call it sometimes is advocacy with a small a as opposed to a big A.
It's a big one to tackle, Sharona. I think it's not an easy question, is it? But yeah, wondering if any of our panelists have any thoughts on it.
So, working in the village as a health aide and coming to the city and working in the big hospitals, I always thought that even one day in the small rural community for a provider who's working in the hospital and they see patients that come in from the small communities, I think just one day to see where they come from and to see the healthcare that they have there would be very beneficial for a provider that is working in the hospital, that take care of the people that come in from the rural communities. So I always encourage the main hospital here in Anchorage, and the people living in the smaller hubs that service the more rural villages. I always make a suggestion to them saying that, even one day in the village to see what the people live like and where they come from would be helpful. And that's what I always thought. So.
Britton, I can jump in just a little, I think, as well. I believe if I understood your question, I think that there are, and I think it echoes Kwana's comments as well, and that, I think most locations where some of the educational institutions are based, et cetera, there are outreach services available. I think there would be friendship centers and or Indigenous focused clinics within some of those jurisdictions that would be great experiences, I think, for an eager student within the PA program to be able to, interface, learn from the clients of those services within urban centers. Urban Indigenous populations have huge needs as well. And I think that advocacy role, that learning of the experience, sorry, my phone, is equally, but distinct from the issues that exist within rural and remote locations. So, getting that experience of the challenges of the Indigenous populations that live within some of the more urban centers as well is huge, and requires or would be an excellent learning opportunity, I think, for a new student, and would help them incorporate some of those really important cultural competencies within their practice as well. So hopefully that wasn't off the mark with your question.
And I'll just add a very brief comment to that I would encourage them to ask a lot of questions, ask patients and people they encounter to share their stories, and really seek out opportunities to learn. I find a lot of students sometimes shy away from rural clinical rotations and placements because it's outside of their comfort. But really, I think that's where the most impactful and meaningful clinical encounters are going to happen. And so it's really important to take those opportunities as they come, or to challenge the system and try to ask for electives, because those opportunities are often like really incredible for learning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do have an online question coming to me via my iPhone from Eric. Is wondering, Leila, if ISC can help them in BC. They're building a few proposals in collaboration with First Nation Health Authority, and wondering if you would be able to support or help them in BC.
Well, I mean, it depends. I mean, I think so. It's kind of a little bit general. However, just to clarify, we actually have devolved Indigenous Services Canada's role to the First Nations Health Authority in British Columbia. So, but certainly our relationship with First Nation Health Authority is still strong. We meet regularly, and should this be something that is outside of their funding formulas or their ability to design, I mean, we continue to have conversations with them on that. But generally, the ownership control for the work of First Nation Health Authority resides within the First Nations Health Authority, but we work and communicate regularly with them in support of advancing their mandate, including innovations and models as well. So, you know, I think we support initiatives that the First Nations Health Authority put forward, and should there be additional resources and or authorities or that may need to come, we meet regularly with them to help them advance what they have prioritized as an organization, as the items that they want to advance. So for sure, we're there to support anything that the Indigenous or that the First Nations Health Authority put forward in regards to items that they may require additional support on. That's a bit vague, but so thanks for your question, Eric. Yeah, you know, I think the priorities of the First Nation Health Authority, you know, are designed and you know, owned by them, and should they require additional resources, that's where we connect, and we're there to support them as much as we can. So thanks.
Thank you. I'll pass it over to you, Guillaume, if there are any questions in the room.
Yeah, one more.
Morning. My name is Renee. I'm a PA practicing on Manitoulin Island. Hello, Britain. I'm a class of 2020 U of T grad as well. So I'm not of Indigenous background, but anyone who knows Manitoulin Island knows that it's a large freshwater island in the middle of Lake Huron, and about half Indigenous population. So I do work with a lot of Indigenous folks. And in the program, I do remember sort of trying to facilitate these sort of experiences that I think Tara was speaking about a little bit, that the University of Manitoba does put together. And I was just wondering, sort of as a person who's well placed to maybe make a difference in Indigenous health, excuse me, how the programs are now looking to support that a little bit more, because I had sort of inquired about, you know, getting some placements in the more northern communities and more Indigenous communities and that type of thing. And that wasn't an opportunity back in, I guess, 2019, 2020. So is there any progress that the programs are doing? And to add to that, I was just recently, I believe it was Tara that did the OHS position sort of not a lunch and learn, but a learning information session for some fly in, fly out positions out in northern Manitoba, which I'm interested in, but now sort of feel like it's a barrier because I've never been. So it's very intimidating to just go out there, sort of as a leap of faith in your career. And I think it really would have been helpful if I had some of these experiences as a student. So just sort of putting that out there to the programs to see what progress has been made in that regard.
This would have been a fantastic question for Joseph LeBlanc, who could speak about NOSM and everything NOSM is doing. Renee from our program, the U of T NOSM program, I can say that we do currently have 2 rotations in Thunder Bay that do take place. One is on a reserve. The other one is for Indigenous patients who live in town. So there's certainly, and sorry, I know I'm not a panelist, but there's certainly not what I'd like or where I'd like to see the programs be quite at this stage. I'd like to see us have either a full Indigenous stream or certainly more opportunities for students who wish to go on to a reserve and do a clinical rotation there, have the option to do so. But certainly we're not quite there yet. But since you were a student, we do have a couple more opportunities, which is great. But I'll pass it over to Tara. I don't know if you can speak to U of M's program. I mean, they do clinical rotations in Garden Hill, I believe. Not sure if that was part of your education or if that was since, but wondering if you can speak to that at all.
I can try. I'm not sure I'm really the ideal person to speak on behalf of the University of Manitoba or the program for PAs. I do have some awareness of they're working on cultivating these opportunities. It is a big key priority of theirs for sure. And I think in a perfect world, every medical learner from every discipline would do some rotations through within a First Nations community. I'd have to really think about this, but we've made a lot of progress as well from a PA perch. Renee, as you mentioned, you attended the soiree, if you want to call it, where we just discuss what we're doing, creating some awareness, stirring up conversations around PAs working within Northern Health. We do have clinical rotation sites in Garden Hill as well as Percy Moore, and we hope to grow that over time. I hope other universities are doing the same. I agree, it would have been a perfect question for him. So we may have to do some offline considerations and give our responses at a later time, but that's probably where I would leave it from my perch, just because, like I said, I can't really speak on behalf of what the university is doing right now, other than sort of secondhand, and that we're working very collaboratively with them to recognize it's really imperative to have those really
We lost you a bit there, Tara. You were a little bit robotic towards the end. I don't know if you want to summarize again, see if we can hear you. Or you want to leave it there?
Sorry, is that better?
Yes.
Not sure where things fell off the track, but just in summary, like I said, in a perfect world, every medical learner, every person within every province needs to go see and spend time on a First Nations community, not just for exposure clinically, but just for ourselves to realize the disparities that are acutely apparent, and that I'm not the person to speak on behalf of the University of Manitoba, but that we are working collaboratively with them to allow for students to come through and have as much exposure as possible.
Thanks, Tara. And Renee, I just pulled up my notes from my master's project, and I have written down that Manitoba offers a 4-week community health rotation in fly-in community of Garden Hills First Nation. which sounds amazing. And I think all programs should offer something similar for students who wish to get that experience.
Brittany, I can,
Um,
oh, sorry.
yes,
Yeah, I
no,
just
go
wanted
ahead.
to sort of add to that. There are some, I would say, considerations around, I agree 100% around like opening up those opportunities. There are systemically over time some challenges associated with that. I know even within nursing, with the number of frontline nurses there to preceptor, et cetera, is there, but it's always a challenge in regards to getting the time for really, really busy people in remote locations to take on some of those roles. But there's some basic infrastructure challenges that we have around accommodations, and those that we really need to work on, and cost for the student. Like it's pretty significant in regards to the travel. So I think there's work to be done, and we are working on, as an organization, improving the professional accommodations and visiting professional accommodations, et cetera. But we've often, certainly within nursing, have been really challenged just with the infrastructure of having the space for students to live and stay when they're so, that is something that collectively we have to work on to improve. I mean, housing is an issue for community members as well, of course. But we also are at times challenged for an ability to just house supernumerary or extra sort of health professionals within the location. But I agree 100%. We need to work harder at making more opportunities across the spectrum for all students who are interested in gaining experience and working within that level of health service delivery. So thanks.
Thank you. Guillaume, any more questions in person?
Any more questions from the floor? Anything else on online, Britton?
I apologize to everyone online. Again, I'm not sure if you're just a quiet group or if nothing has come in, but certainly nothing's coming up in my chat.
Thank you very much all, and especially the panelists and Britton for moderating the sessions. Special thanks to Kwana, not only because it was 4:30 when she had to actually start the session, but for all your insight. I still remember our first phone conversation that we had with Christy, and all the good points you brought in, how we welcome First Nation students, but also what we need to think of as what could be a deterrent for a future student to actually join one of our programs. So thank you very much for your time that you actually spend with us on this. And not to steal another quote from a colleague that wrote down earlier, but I think one thing interesting in the session that was mentioned, it's fitted just for me. I'm not going to look at my other colleagues, but yeah, I'm also old fashioned, and it's great to think with our brains sometimes and not just an iPhone. So thank you very much all for your participation again. Round of applause, please, for our panelists. Sure, great subject that will follow up next year on the next conference that will look alike as a progression of what we're trying to present through these panel discussion on the Friday morning. So without further ado, I'll give the floor back to Kevin.
I'd like to echo Guillaume's appreciation for the panelists and this important topic. I hope everyone gets some rest and feels better. And even though it was an early start, we really appreciated your insights. Thank you very much. So at this point, we'll say goodbye to the panelists and we'll start thinking about the next phase, which will be a brief break. We'll move our way down. Those who are joining us for the Remembrance Day ceremony. It's just on the road. You just on the road. You just follow the crowd, and we'll rejoin here for a lunch and a chance to meet with our network, and network with our sponsors.